Well, good morning, Spring Lake Village, and thank you for joining me once again as we continue our lecture series on the history of the Armenian people. Well, last week we discussed how historic Armenia was a pawn of empires, in particular the Byzantine Empire in the west, and in the east, the Persian Empire, now under the control of the Sasanian dynasty. We also examined the first great diaspora of the Armenian people. You'll recall that the Sasanians had forced many of the Armenians to relocate, and many Armenians eventually were forced to flee to the area of southwestern Anatolia, present-day Turkey, where they established Little Armenia, or Armenia Minor, or Cilician Armenia. Cilicia was a region in southeastern Anatolia, present-day Turkey. And the Armenians who settled there very much had an impact on the West. They flourished as great merchants. Many of them married into the noble houses of Europe, in particular the French. We showed how many of the Armenian architects were famed in that part of the world, influencing fortification architecture and the development of crusader castles. And the Armenians of this area were very much influenced by European culture, again, marrying into European families and for all the world adapting Western way of life. Well, this week I'd like to continue our survey of Armenia, and we will devote the last 15 minutes or so to the bleakest period in the history of the Armenian people, namely the Armenian genocide of 1915. Although there were wholesale slaughters of the Armenian people when Armenia was in the control of the Ottomans as well as the Russian Empire. So let's begin then our continuation of the history of Armenia. So as we discussed from the very beginning, Armenia's strategic location was all important as a pawn of these mighty empires that surrounded Little Armenia. It was, in fact, a crossroads of international commerce. So Eastern Armenia, which was located in the South Caucasus, had been a battleground for the rivalry between Turkish and Persian states. So in the early 16th century, we now find Western Armenia in the hands of a new Islamic dynasty, namely the Ottoman Turks, who had succeeded the Seljuk Turks. So Western historic Armenia now in the hands of the Ottomans, and the eastern portion of historic Armenia is in the hands of a new Persian dynasty, the Safavids, who ruled out of the Persian capital of Esfahan, that glittering capital of Iran. So the Safavids, the last great flowering of Persian culture. And Armenia was essentially a satellite state, a vassal state within the Persian realm. And as we saw in our previous lecture, the Persians would force many Armenians to settle within the heart of their empire. But by the 17th century, many of the Persians fled, many forcibly as part of another diaspora. And we find Armenians living as far afield as Poland in the west, and in the east in India, and some Armenians even went as far as China. Many of these Armenians of the diaspora, of the Armenian diaspora, were upper class. Many were bankers, merchants, successful um, entrepreneurs. And remember that within those that territory now of Western Armenia in the hands of the Ottoman Turks, a Muslim state, the Christian Armenians, remember, they remained for the most part Orthodox Christians. They were resistant to conversion to Islam. Their legal status was that of a dhimmi, which is a Arabic word that refers to the legal status of Christians as well as Jews, the so-called people of the book. They had legal protection in theory within the Islamic Ottoman state. Now, in this new diaspora, again, that took place at this time in the 17th century, where we find Armenians fleeing to the west and to the east, we find the beginning of a liberation movement, the call for breaking away from these powerful taskmasters. And already in the late 17th century, in particular in 1678, a secret society was formed among wealthy Armenian bankers and merchants, and it was strategically held in the oldest church in historic Armenia, the one you see to the left. This is the famous Akhmiadzin Cathedral. This is to the Armenian Orthodox as the Church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, or present-day Istanbul, is to the Greek Orthodox. But at this particular junction, the Armenians were unable to break away from these very powerful empires, so they would have to seek help from another superpower. This is a pretty good map showing the diaspora of the Armenian people. You can see how they migrated to other parts of the Middle East and even into India and the Far East. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to show a map of the diaspora in the West, but this gives a good idea of how widely dispersed the Armenian people were at this time. This is a map, once again, of present-day Armenia. This is Armenia today with its capital of Yerevan. I did want to show you how historic Armenia was located in the South Caucasus region. This is the North Caucasus region and the Transcaucasus region. In our last lecture, we will be talking about the contested region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is in present-day Azerbaijan, but sizable Armenian community lives there even today. So as I mentioned already, in the late 17th century, attempts to call for the independence of the Armenian people, to regain their independence from the great empires that controlled them. And in 1701, a very interesting nobleman by the name of Israel Ori would make it his life mission to seek the independence of the Armenian people. Now, Ori was born in Karabakh. That's the region I just alluded to, Nagorno-Karabakh. That was a contested region of historic Armenia. This Israel Ori, who was born in around the last half of the quarter of the 17th century, would seek to, he was born in 1659. We find him part of a embassy that set off to the Holy See in order for the Catholic Church to broker a treaty. Sorry about that. You may have heard the phone ring. I just turned it off. In any case, this Armenian nobleman by the name of Israel Ori sought to broker some kind of arrangement between the Holy See, but then we find him turning to the greatest Orthodox empire in the world, namely the Russian Empire to the north. And in 1701, he was part of a mission to Moscow to seek the aid of none other than Peter the Great that you see here. One of Russia's greatest czars, the one who founded the great city of St. Petersburg. So Peter the Great did agree. Obviously, Armenia, an Orthodox Christian nation, he wanted it to be under the Russian sphere of influence. And unfortunately, Israel Ori died before that dream, his great dream of a free Armenia, could be realized. But Peter the Great had agreed. And in 1722, he declared war on the Safavids of Persia. And Armenians now living in Georgia and Karabakh, again, where Israel Ori had been born, would help the Russian army rebel against the Safavids of Persia. And in 1778, Catherine the Great would encourage Armenian merchants to settle in the all-important Crimea region on the Black Sea, in particular, the outpost of Nor Nakhchivan near Rostov on the Don River. So as we've seen in the previous lecture, the Byzantines and the Persians encouraged Armenian merchants to resettle owing to their ability, their genius as great entrepreneurs to help jumpstart these disparate economies. Now in 1801, the Tsar Alexander I would annex the important Georgian kingdom of Kakheti, which now gave the Russian Empire for the first time an important stronghold in this very strategic region that straddles the southern Black Sea all the way to the Caspian, the Trans-Caucasian region. And over the course of the next 30 years or so, the Russian Empire, now with a foothold, sought to expand its hegemony in the Caucasus at the expense of the Ottoman Turks and the Safavid Persians. So the people of Armenia, very much as Orthodox, wanted to be part of the Russian Empire. Again, the largest Orthodox Christian polity. Uh, Again, the Armenian people remain steadfast in their orthodoxy. They did not want to convert either to Islam at the hands of the Ottoman Turks or the new Islamic religion that had been embraced in Safavid Persia. Safavid Persia was also Islamic at this time. So in the Western region, the Armenians were living under the brutal yoke of the Ottoman government. So then war broke out between Russia and Safavid Persia, the 9-year engagement called the Russian-Persian Wars. And at the end of it, Russia emerged triumphant, gaining control over eastern Georgia, Azerbaijan, and northern Armenia. And 15 years later, in 1821, Russia captured eastern Armenia from Persia. So now the historic center, the historic core of Armenia is under the Russian Empire. So here you can see is a map showing the Russian Empire and control of the strategic area of Armenia, the 6 Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire that will remain in Ottoman hands. So over the course of the next several decades, we will see Armenians prosper greatly and embrace the ideals of the French Enlightenment. So we find many of the merchant class accumulating great wealth, the rise of a true Armenian bourgeoisie as capitalism and industrialization begins to spread into the area of the Transcaucasus, already to the end of the 19th century. In the capital of Georgia, Tbilisi, we have a very, very wealthy Armenian community that had set about to buy up large tracts of land and property that had formerly been in the hands of the Georgian nobility that had gone into a decline after the emancipation of the Russian serfs. So the Georgian nobility had acquired great wealth as a result of its ownership of Russian serfs who farmed in their great wealthy tracts of land from which they derived great revenue. And also at this time, the discovery of the great oil fields in the Baku region of Azerbaijan. Many wily Armenians, enterprising Armenians, had invested heavily in the oil fields of Baku and became immensely wealthy. So this is, at this time, we see many Armenians becoming tremendously wealthy, but even at the end of the 19th century, the overwhelming majority of Armenians living in the Russian Empire were still essentially peasants working the land to try to subsistence farming in order to exist. Now, we do find Armenians more and more eschewing the culture of the Middle East and embracing, again, the liberal ideas of the European Enlightenment, uh, again, that began in France, and the intellectual ferment of the era of Romanticism. So the so-called Armenian Enlightenment would begin very much um, during the period of the mid 19th century. So around the 1850s, many intellectual Armenians embraced the ideas of the Enlightenment, seeking first and foremost to better the condition of the Armenian peasants, and at the same time to seek independence from the yoke of the Ottoman Turks. So this movement gained a foothold, especially among the elite, the intelligentsia, as well as young students who were studying in some of the great universities of Europe, or many who were living in the great cities of Russia and the Caucasus as well. These were the blue bloods of the Armenian elite. We have a distinctive class called the Amiras, who lived in Constantinople and in Smyrna, um, present day Izmir, who had been sent by their families to study in Europe. And these male students would embrace progressive liberal ideas, European Enlightenment ideas, and they would be at the forefront of this Enlightenment movement, this intellectual movement calling for the independence of the Armenian people. So we find them establishing newspapers, also trying to modernize the Armenian language. They were part of Armenian literary flowering at this time to spread the word among the Armenians living in the diaspora, uh, as well as those living in the Armenian realm, calling for the independence of the Armenian people and promulgating the Armenian language, again, which had been modernized. There were also Protestant missionaries from the United States who establish schools of learning and medical facilities and churches all over Anatolia, who inculcated in the Armenian people the ideals of American democracy. They played a very important role. In fact, some Armenians converted to Protestantism. And although the overwhelming majority of Armenians were Orthodox Christians, we do find some of them converting, as I mentioned, to Protestantism, as well as to Catholicism. But this would remain a minority among the Armenian community at large. So we will now examine the darkest chapter in the history of the Armenian people. Now, within the Ottoman Empire, which in the second half of the 19th century was designated by the great powers the sick man of Europe, the corruption of the Sublime Porte out of Istanbul. Um, the Ottoman Empire is beginning to fragment and implode. But there were efforts to try to reform and modernize the Armenian government under the so-called Tanzimat system that tried to bring more civil rights to those living under the Ottoman yoke. And this, of course, included the Armenian Christians. And so there was some improvement, some reforms, but now we have, unfortunately, the rising tide of calls for persecution of the Armenians living within the Ottoman Empire, the so-called Armenian question. Now, this presages is sort of, in some ways, foreshadows the horrible history of the Jewish people living in Europe. I mean, the Jewish question in Europe some decades later. But here we have, in the last quarter of the 19th century, the Armenian question. Now, the war between Russia and the Ottomans, the Russo-Turkish War, we find Armenians participating. After that engagement, the Russian Empire demanded that the Sultan from the Sublime Court in Istanbul institute reforms that would benefit the Armenian subjects. And the Tsar also demanded that the Armenians be protected against the Kurdish population that was trying to eliminate those Armenians living in the eastern realm, the region, the very eastern realm of Turkey into Iraq, an area, of course, that's been very much contested over the last century or so, and the Kurds obviously demanding that they have their own independent country. So this Armenian question was very much an important factor now in international affairs, with Great Britain assuming a more important role as the protector, Turkey's protector at large, but also trying to protect this Armenian population living within the Ottoman Empire. Geopolitically, what the Ottomans feared more than anything else was the loss of Western Armenia from its control. It had just lost a number of territories in the Balkans, and the grand vision of the Ottomans of a pan-Turkic empire that stretched all the way from the Balkans as far as the Yellow Sea in the east was deteriorating, was falling apart. This had been the grand vision of the sultans of the Sublime Porte. So we have a new policy that emerges that will be absolutely horrific for Armenians living in the Ottoman Empire, centered around this so-called Armenian question that would call for the complete annihilation of the Armenians living in their historic homeland stretching back 3.5 millennia. And so we find now brutal sultans unleashing a genocide against the Armenian population living in Ottoman territory. And the worst of these was the one that was launched by Abdul Hamid, and the infamous Hamidian massacres that took place between 1894 and 1897. So this is some 20 years before the Great Armenian Genocide of 1915. During the Hamidian massacres, some 300,000 Armenians. This is the number now given through an examination of primary source material. Armenians were slaughtered, especially those among the upper classes in Cilicia, Istanbul. So Cilicia, which was the home of Little Armenia, as well as Greater Armenia as well. The situation would get worse with the rise of the so-called Young Turks. Now, again, in 1878, the Ottoman Constitution was suspended. And at that point, we find a young group, a young cabal of reform-minded Ottomans seeking to take control of the Ottoman Empire and to bring about new reforms. They worked underground, and in the 1890s, Armenians and Turks collectively were calling for reformist movements to overhaul the law in the Ottoman Empire. A political party was created called the Committee of Union and Progress. And the heart of this movement, its backbone is, if you will, consisted of young military officers who called themselves the Young Turks. They were very much upset by the waning power of the Ottoman Empire at the expense of the great powers. And they were working actively underground under the watchful eye of the infamous secret police of the Sultan Hamad, Sultan Abdul Hamad, in order to bring about change. And in 1908, the Young Turks were successful. They too had the support of many minorities, the Armenian Christians, the Greek communities, the Greek Orthodox community, Jews and other minorities living under the yoke of the Ottoman Empire to carry out a revolution and reestablish a new constitution that in turn would guarantee equality under the law for these minority communities. But as was the case before under Tanzimat, that reform Muslim movement, the old guard, the old traditionalists of Muslim society would not recognize non-Muslims as equal because they would not convert to Islam. And even after the Young Turks took control and tried to initiate revolution, we find this tremendous animus, even among the Young Turks, to purge the Ottoman Empire of non-Muslims, and in particular, Armenians. And in 1909, in the city of Adana in Cilicia, hundreds of Armenians were slaughtered, especially the elite merchant class. And this sadly would set the stage for an out-and-out genocide of the Armenian people. That Committee of Union and Progress, abbreviated the CPU, called for Turkish nationalism, but its philosophy was very anti-non-Muslim. It was very xenophobic, if you will, very much against a multicultural, multi-religious society. What it wanted was a pure Turkish society, so overtones of Aryanism, and one that was purely Islamic. The CUP would be successful in an all-out coup d'etat in January of 1913, following the ignominious defeat of the Ottoman army in the First Balkan War of 1912. And now the CUP takes firm control over the political reins of power in Istanbul. The Ottoman parliament is under its complete control. And whereas the Ottoman Sultan previously maintained certain alliances with the great powers, in particular Great Britain and France, now it turned to Germany, the enemy of the alliance of Great Britain and France, in the years just preceding World War I. So with the Young Turks in firm control with its political party called the CUP, the Young Turks were calling for the complete supremacy of the Turkish race at the expense of minorities living within the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Young Turks were very much influenced by the ideology they had embraced as students in many of the great universities. So Marxism and socialism were at the heart of their ideology. And they were calling for this pan-Turkic polity in which Turks living not only in the eastern realm of Anatolia, but going into Central Asia, the Turks of Uzbekistan, of Turkestan, of the Kazakh region, the Tatars of the region would all unify into this one great pan-Turkish nation. So although Marxism at its core was egalitarian, in fact, we do not see this call for egalitarianism being played out. Now the minorities, Christian minority of Armenians and Greeks, as well as Jews, would be now considered second-class citizenry that had to be removed. The great new Turkic empire would have to be ethnically cleansed, if you will, this term now that gained currency. So at the outbreak of World War I, we find the great crime being launched against the Armenian people, called in Armenian the Mexyegern, like the Armenian Shoah, the genocide of the Armenian people. It began on April the 24th in 1915 in the great city of Constantinople, which had been renamed Istanbul. Many of the Armenian intellectuals, professors, tenured professors at many of the great universities and institutes. Many of the leaders of the Armenian community were summarily rounded up and executed. As many as maybe as 800 or so. The numbers are a little foggy. And in Eastern Turkey, all Armenians between the age of 15 and 62 were disarmed. Many were conscripted, and those who were unfit to serve in the military were executed. And during the Metz-Yeghern, launched in the spring of 1915, tragically, Armenian women were rounded up, children, the elderly, and forced to flee into the Syrian desert of Deir el-Zar. Horrific stories have come to light as more information has been collected over the last several years, in the same way that the Shoah Foundation has created an archive of primary information, firsthand accounts of cruel acts, of barbaric acts committed against the Armenian people. A lot of this work has been spearheaded by the great film director Adam Agoyan and other artists as well. So the horrible stories of women and children being forced in the blazing sun to walk naked, many horribly killed en route into the Syrian desert by Turkish officers as well as Kurds. Many of course, simply died under the brutal sun. Many starved. The numbers, of course, are not altogether known, but as more and more information has been gathered, the number of those who died during the Great Crime, the Metz-Yeghern, the genocide of the Armenians, the number who died between 1915 and 1923 may be as high as 1.5 million. Some even say it reached 2 million. We'll perhaps never know, but the numbers, of course, are incalculable. So here we have a true genocide, the first genocide of the 20th century, a genocide that presages the Shoah, the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of the Nazis, taking place 2 decades before the Jewish genocide. And it was the Armenian genocide that would very much inspire the horrific genocide of the Jews at the hands of the Nazis. Even the young Turk philosophy, the pan-Turkic philosophy, the ideas of ethnic cleansing would be taken up in the Aryan philosophy of the Nazis some 20 years later. So one of the most tragic events of the 20th century, of course, and I will show you here some, here, this is the Assyrian desert, Deir el-Zawa here, Zawir, Deir al-Zawir. This is the region where many Armenians were forced to migrate and where thousands and thousands perished. Now I'm going to show you some brutal imagery these black and white photographs that look very reminiscent of black and white photography that we're all familiar with of the Jews that died at the hands of the Nazis, the Jewish genocide. Here again, the bones and skulls of Armenians. Again, echoes of the Jewish Holocaust. The pictures speak volumes. These children being led to death. Again, reminiscent of Jewish children being led to the death camps of Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, etc. Children walking in the Syrian desert. Whole families who never survived, experiencing unspeakable crimes at the hands of Turkish officers and Kurdish officers as well. Here, a horrific scene of bones, of skeletal remains of a former Armenian community, all perished. So that's, again, this is a very horrible story. Next week, we'll wrap up our discussion of the Armenian people. It's the period of the Armenian people after World War I and into the 21st century. So look forward to seeing you all again next week. Until then, please take care and stay safe.